Imagine a man, Nathaniel Owen Clark, who once believed he had the world in his hands. Boardrooms were his home, numbers his closest companions, and the past nothing more than a shadow he could bury. But then, on a quiet afternoon in the park, a tiny silver bracelet on the wrist of a 6-year-old girl shattered everything he thought he knew. Zoe, her blue eyes a painful mirror of his own, her voice as soft as a whisper in the wind, and a 7-year secret he had never imagined, he was her father. Can a man who once chased ambition learn to stand still for love? Can a mother like Aria, scarred by the past, find the courage to open her heart once more? And will Zoe, as timid as a fawn, dare to believe that her father will stay? This isn't just a story about a family lost, it's a journey of rediscovery, struggle, and redemption, where every step echoes the question, how much would you sacrifice to make up for what was lost? Hit the subscribe button now so you won't miss these profound stories and the life lessons woven into every heartbeat of our characters. We're here to explore, to feel, and to rediscover life's most precious treasures, week by week, day by day. Subscribe now, because you deserve stories that warm your heart. Nathaniel Owen Clark, a man who once believed the past could be buried beneath the dust of time like an old chest in a damp attic, never imagined it would rise from the grave on a quiet afternoon in the park. 7 years ago, he lost Aria Michelle Young, the woman who was once the heartbeat of his soul, the lighthouse that guided him through his darkest nights. Since then, he had lived like a lost ship, throwing himself into suffocating boardrooms, cold numbers, and high-stakes contracts. But today, fate, that cruel trickster that loves to toy with wounded hearts, had thrown an emotional grenade his way, wrapped in the form of a tiny girl with midnight curls and eyes as blue as a summer sky. That park was nothing more than a passing backdrop to Nathaniel, a living painting he seldom paid attention to, families bursting with laughter, couples lost in whispered dreams beneath the trees, joggers racing as if chasing lost time. He walked slowly along the cobblestone path, hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored coat, a piece of expensive armor he wore against the world. His life had become a series of dry financial reports, razor-sharp negotiations, and restless nights haunted by dancing numbers. This park was just a rare pit stop, a brief inhale between the storms he willingly threw himself into. And then he saw her. A little angel sitting quietly on a weathered wooden bench, her small legs swinging in rhythm like a forgotten childhood melody. She couldn't have been more than 6, with dark curls framing a delicate face like a wreath of nature's design. Her bright blue eyes gleamed like twin sapphires beneath the fading sunlight. But it wasn't her adorableness that made Nathaniel freeze, it was what she was holding. A silver bracelet, small and elegant, with a heart-shaped charm that shimmered like a whisper from the past. His heart pounded, breath tightening in his chest as if an invisible hand had seized his lungs. That was the bracelet he had given Aria Michelle Young 7 years ago, a gift he had chosen with his whole heart, a promise of forever that had crumbled into nothing but memories. His steps faltered like a drunken man's, his mind spinning like a wind-blown leaf. Aria, the woman he had loved so fiercely, the woman who had vanished without a trace, leaving him with an emptiness as deep as a black hole, was suddenly close again, hidden in that tiny silver charm. He moved toward the little girl, each step heavier than the last, his usual confidence, the weapon he had sharpened in million-dollar negotiations, melting like mist in the morning sun. "That's a beautiful bracelet," he said, his voice carefully measured, though inside him, a storm raged. The girl looked up, her deep blue gaze locking onto his, something hauntingly familiar flickering through her expression, like a distant memory just out of reach. "Thank you," she replied, her voice as clear as a bell. She glanced down at the bracelet, her tiny fingers tracing the charm. "It belongs to my mother." Nathaniel swallowed hard, his throat as dry as a desert. He had suspected it from the moment he saw the bracelet, but hearing it aloud was like a knife to the chest, sending his heart racing in a chaotic rhythm. "What's your mother's name?" he asked, his voice betraying a slight tremor. The little girl tilted her head, her bright eyes shimmering with innocent curiosity. "Aria," she answered, simple, sharp, and precise, like an arrow hitting its mark. Nathaniel's world tilted, the ground shifting beneath his feet. Aria. She was here. And this little girl, Zoe, as she later introduced herself, who bore his eyes so unmistakably, sat before him, blissfully unaware that she had just thrown open the locked doors of a past he had tried to forget for 7 long years. He knelt down to her level, his heart hammering like a war drum. "That's a beautiful name, Zoe," he said, his voice softer than he had intended. She smiled, a small but genuine smile, that reminded him so painfully of Aria in their early days together. Radiant, warm, and full of life. "Is your mother here?" he asked, treading carefully as if walking on thin ice. Zoe nodded and glanced toward the end of the park. "We live over there," she said, pointing to a quiet street lined with houses peeking through the trees. "Mom told me not to go too far." Nathaniel exhaled slowly, struggling to contain the tidal wave of emotions crashing inside him. Aria was there, just minutes away. And for the first time in 7 years, the answers to his sleepless nights, the questions that had tormented him, "Why did she leave me?" seemed within reach. But first, he needed to know one more thing. A question heavier than the weight of time itself. "Zoe," he said gently, "do you know who your father is?" She hesitated, her small fingers brushing over the silver heart of the bracelet, her bright eyes clouded with a sadness beyond her years. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, as fragile as rustling leaves. "Mom never told me. She said Daddy was very busy, that he had important things to do." Nathaniel clenched his jaw, a sharp pain cutting through him like a blade. So that was what Aria had told their daughter, that he was too busy, too distant to be part of her life. He wanted to be angry, to shout his frustrations to the heavens, but more than anything, he wanted to understand. "Have you ever wondered about him?" he asked, his voice deep and steady like the surface of a still lake. Zoe shrugged, her blue eyes glimmering with a quiet longing. "Sometimes," she said. "But I think, if Daddy wanted to find me, he would come." The words hit Nathaniel like a sledgehammer, shattering the walls of pride he had built over the years. He looked at Zoe, his daughter, the child he had never known, the little girl who carried his eyes and Aria's smile, and for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Owen Clark, a man who once believed he controlled everything, felt small, powerless, and consumed by an overwhelming desire to make things right. Nathaniel Owen Clark took a deep breath, as if trying to draw the entire atmosphere of the park into his lungs to calm his racing heart. If he had known that fate, the mischievous trickster that delights in toying with lost souls, would lead him to this moment, no mountain, no ocean could have kept him from finding her again. He inhaled slowly once more, like a man about to step through the door of destiny, then turned to Zoe, a little girl with deep blue eyes, as clear as autumn waters, glistening with innocent curiosity. "Can you take me to your mother?" he asked, his voice softer than a request, more like a plea. Zoe tilted her head slightly, her dark curls swaying like the wings of nocturnal butterflies, as if weighing the decision of whether to trust this stranger. But perhaps it was Nathaniel's gaze, deep, sincere, tinged with the desperation of a man who had just found a lost piece of his soul, that reached her. After what felt like an eternity of hesitation, she nodded. "Okay," Zoe said, her voice as clear as wind chimes, then slid off the old wooden bench and gestured for him to follow. Nathaniel rose to his feet, his pulse pounding like the beat of a war drum. Every step beside the little girl was a countdown to the moment he would stand before Aria Michelle Young, the woman who had once been his light, his darkness, his everything. They walked along the winding path of the park, where crisp autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet like a late-season melody. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and old memories, a quiet reminder that the past never truly fades. Nathaniel glanced at Zoe, the daughter he never knew he had, walking with the carefree grace of childhood, her tiny hand clutching a silver bracelet as if it held the universe's greatest secret. A storm of emotions swirled inside him. Where had Aria gone? Why had she left him? Had she ever thought of him during those long, lonely nights? But never, not once, had he dared to dream that she had taken a part of him with her, a daughter, hidden away like a treasure locked in the chest of time. Zoe didn't know, of course she didn't. She couldn't possibly realize that every innocent step she took was leading Nathaniel straight to a door he had buried beneath years of dust and denial. They turned onto a quiet street, where modest houses nestled beneath the shade of ancient oak trees. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mixed with the sweet aroma of home-cooked dinners drifting from somewhere nearby, a simple, peaceful world, completely separate from the cold boardrooms and gleaming cars that Nathaniel had long called home. Zoe stopped in front of a quaint little house, its white shutters faded by time, its red brick pathway warm and inviting. The porch light flickered like a tiny lighthouse, casting a golden glow over the encroaching evening. "This is it," Zoe said, pointing toward the door, her voice light, unaware of the weight this moment carried. Nathaniel looked up, staring at the house, his heart hammering against his ribs. Aria was there, just beyond that weathered wooden door, after 7 long years of silence. 7 years of questions, woven like invisible threads that bound his soul, and sleepless nights filled with the same tormenting thoughts. Why did she leave? Did she ever think of me? Now, the answers were within reach, close enough that he could almost feel their breath against his skin. He turned to Zoe, swallowing hard to steady his voice. "Does your mother know you're bringing me here?" Zoe shook her head, her bright eyes shimmering with innocence. "No, but she'll be happy. I think," she said. Then, hesitating for a moment, she added, "Mom doesn't have visitors often." Nathaniel let out a quiet, hollow laugh, one laced with a tinge of bitterness. There was no turning back now. He stepped onto the porch, his hand trembling as he knocked on the door, each knock echoing like the toll of fate's bell. A long silence followed, stretching so unbearably that he could swear he heard the sound of his heart hitting the polished leather of his shoes. Then, footsteps, soft, almost hesitant. The door creaked open. And there she was. Aria Michelle Young stood before him, beautiful as a broken dream, her deep brown eyes widening in shock. In that moment, she looked exactly as she had 7 years ago, gentle, captivating, etched into his memory like an indelible painting. But then, reality hit like a cold wave. Her hair was longer now, her eyes carried the weight of time, and faint lines traced the sorrow of unspoken years. She stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. And Nathaniel, gripping the doorframe like a man standing at the edge of an abyss, felt the same. 1,000 words clamored to be spoken, but they lodged in his throat like caged birds, wings beating frantically against an invisible barrier. Aria glanced at Zoe, who stood quietly, observing with a child's unfiltered curiosity. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Zoe, sweetheart, go inside for a moment." Zoe nodded, her small feet padding into the house, leaving only the two of them standing there, suspended in a silence thick enough to drown in. Nathaniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay steady. 7 years, Aria, he said, his voice low, deep, and rippling with emotion. 7 years, and you never told me I had a daughter. Aria closed her eyes, as if trying to escape the weight of his gaze. When she opened them again, unshed tears shimmered like unfallen stars. "I wanted to," she whispered, her voice as fragile as rustling leaves. "But I was afraid." Nathaniel clenched his fists, a storm of anger and pain colliding within him like a violent dance. "Afraid of what?" he demanded, his voice now sharp as a blade. She swallowed hard, lips quivering. "Afraid you wouldn't want her." Her words sliced through him, deeper than any wound he had ever endured. He had imagined countless reasons, a new man, a changed heart, or simply that she had moved on, but never, not once, had he considered that she had hidden Zoe from him out of fear that he would reject her. "Aria," he said, his voice both firm and unbearably soft, "you never gave me the choice." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, and he, running a hand through his hair, as if trying to steady himself, knew he had every right to be furious. But more than anything, he needed to understand. He glanced past her, into the warm glow of the house where his daughter, the child he had never known, was waiting. Then, he looked back at Arya, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice resolute. "Because no matter how much time has passed, no matter how many questions remain unanswered, I will not leave here without the truth." Arya Michelle Young stepped back, her small hands trembling as she pushed the door open, as if unveiling a gateway to a past they had both tried to bury. "Come in," she said, her voice as light as the whisper of wind through withered petals, yet laced with an unspoken anxiety. Nathaniel Owen Clark hesitated, his feet seemingly nailed to the porch, his heart pounding like a warhorse bracing for its final battle. Then, he stepped over the threshold, into the warm embrace of the small house, a world utterly foreign to the cold, sleek apartments he was accustomed to, where steel and glass were his only companions. The soft glow from table lamps spread like welcoming arms, and the faint scent of vanilla lingered in the air, a sweet whisper of distant memories. This wasn't just a house, it was a home. A home that he, in his relentless pursuit of conquering the world, had missed. Nathaniel's deep blue eyes swept across the room, like an explorer setting foot on uncharted land. A stack of children's books sat neatly on the worn coffee table, their creased pages bearing silent witness to bedtime stories whispered in the dark. On the refrigerator, a handful of crayon drawings were pinned with heart-shaped magnets, Zoe's, without a doubt. A small pink backpack rested against the door, smudged with dried mud, the mark of carefree afternoons spent running under the sun. This was life, a warm, simple existence. And heartbreakingly, it was one he had not been a part of. Arya led him into the living room, motioning for him to sit on the faded fabric-covered chair, but he remained standing, frozen like a statue abandoned by time. From the hallway, the soft sound of tiny footsteps echoed, a fleeting melody, though their owner remained out of sight, leaving space for the two adults to weather the storm of emotions between them. Nathaniel turned to Arya, his eyes darkening, deep as the sky before a storm. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice low but sharp as a freshly honed blade. Arya sighed, slowly crossing her arms as if bracing herself against the words about to leave her lips. "I never meant to disappear," she admitted, her voice as fragile as the last leaf clinging to a barren branch. "I was afraid, Nathaniel." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Afraid of me? Afraid of what, exactly?" Her brown eyes flickered downward, avoiding the scorching intensity of his gaze. "Afraid of how you would react," she murmured. Nathaniel clenched his jaw, his muscles taut like a bowstring on the verge of snapping. "So instead of telling me, you ran?" Arya lifted her head, defiance flashing in her eyes despite the tears threatening to spill. "You had your whole life mapped out, Nathaniel. Your company was expanding internationally, you were living in skyscrapers and chasing grand dreams. I knew what you wanted, and it wasn't this." She gestured vaguely around the modest room, where the scent of baked goods and the echoes of a child's laughter were the only luxuries she possessed. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, as if trying to extinguish the quiet fire of anger smoldering inside him. "You didn't even give me the chance to choose," he said, his voice heavy as granite. Tears shimmered in Arya's eyes, but she blinked them away furiously, a warrior refusing to surrender. "I thought I was doing the right thing. You were too focused, too determined to succeed. I convinced myself that telling you would destroy everything you were building." Nathaniel's fists tightened, his nails pressing into his palms. "And Zoe? Did you ever think she deserved to know who her father is?" Arya flinched as if his words had struck her like a slap. "I was going to tell her," she choked out, her voice cracking like shattered glass. "I just didn't know when. It was never supposed to get this messy. I thought, maybe one day, when she was older, when you weren't so untouchable." Nathaniel let out a dry, hollow laugh, the sound cracking in the air like wood splitting in the fire. "Untouchable? You really believe I'm that cold? That I wouldn't have wanted her?" He ran a hand through his dark brown hair, disheveled now, mirroring the storm raging within him. Arya's lips trembled, and for the first time, he saw guilt shadowing her face, like a masterpiece tainted by a careless brushstroke. "I didn't know, Nick," she whispered, using the name she hadn't spoken in years. "I didn't know if you wanted to be a father. And I couldn't take the risk of hearing you say no." Nathaniel took a step closer, his voice dropping to something low and steady, warm as the ocean waves lapping at the shore at midnight. "You stole that choice from me, Arya." She swallowed hard, nodding slowly, her eyes glistening like a moonlit lake. "I know." A heavy silence settled between them, thick with words left unsaid, wounds left unhealed. After a long moment, Arya exhaled shakily, as if releasing an invisible weight pressing against her chest. "I never stopped thinking about you," she admitted, her voice small yet raw with truth, a confession from a soul teetering on the edge. Nathaniel closed his eyes, the weight of 7 years pressing down on him like an immovable stone. "You should have come back," he murmured, his voice softer now, an unspoken truce woven into the words. She nodded, and he knew, he could feel it, that she carried her own scars from time, just as he did. His gaze flickered toward the hallway, where the faint echo of Zoe's tiny footsteps had disappeared into silence. She was still hiding, still waiting. Zoe, his daughter. The little girl with his blue eyes, his blood, and even part of his name, though she didn't yet know it. When Nathaniel turned back to Arya, his face was unreadable, both resolute and fractured. "What now, Arya?" he asked, his voice deep as the toll of a bell at dusk. She wiped at her tears quickly, straightening her shoulders, reclaiming a sliver of the pride that had nearly slipped away. "That's up to you." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching hers, delving into the depths of her soul. Then, he made his decision, not as a businessman calculating risk, but as a father, as a man who had once loved and lost. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice steady as stone amidst a rushing river. Because no matter how much time had passed, no matter how cruel the past had been, he knew he couldn't walk away, from the little girl waiting behind that hallway and from the woman who had kept her from him for 7 long years. Arya's breath caught in her throat, like a tiny bird trapped in her chest, when she heard the unwavering words from Nathaniel Owen Clark. 7 years, and I never knew I had a daughter. His voice was deep and steady, like a mountain unmoved by the fiercest storm. A single tear slipped down her cheek, glistening like a pearl in the dim light of the small room. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling like a delicate thread on the verge of breaking. Nathaniel's deep blue eyes didn't waver, sharp as a blade cutting through the darkness. "I mean, for the first time in years, I know exactly what I have to do." He had missed 7 years of Zoe's life, 7 years of first smiles, of unsteady steps, of innocent questions. But now, he swore to himself, no matter what, he would not miss another second. Nathaniel's words hung between them, heavy like a blanket draped over old wounds, shifting the air in the room, like an invisible door creaking open, letting light seep into the dark corners of the past. A man who had made $100 million decisions with icy confidence now stood here, heart pounding for something far simpler yet infinitely more profound, family. "I'm not leaving," he declared, his voice as firm as a judge's gavel closing a long trial. Arya studied him, her deep brown eyes scanning his face, searching for doubt, hesitation, or even the slightest condition. She had expected him to retreat, to bury himself in work and forget the world outside. But not this time. This time, Nathaniel stood like a rock in the middle of a raging river, unshakable. She swallowed hard and nodded slowly. "All right." Nathaniel exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly, like a warrior shedding his heavy armor after battle. "So, what do we tell Zoe?" he asked, his voice softer now, like a father carefully treading an unfamiliar path. Arya hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the dark hallway, where the tiny footsteps of their daughter had long since gone silent. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice as quiet as leaves falling in the wind. I don't want to overwhelm her. Zoe is still just a child. Nathaniel nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes, but so did determination. I know. But she deserves the truth, Arya. I understand, she murmured, her voice gentle like a lullaby, yet filled with the weight of a mother standing at the edge of a life-altering moment. I just don't know how to tell her without scaring her. Nathaniel ran a hand through his dark brown hair, exhaling slowly, as if trying to clear the fog of uncertainty in his mind. Then we do it together, he offered. And in that moment, for the first time in 7 years, he no longer felt alone on this daunting road ahead. Arya pressed her lips together, her eyes shimmering like a lake under moonlight. After what felt like an eternity of silence, she nodded. All right. Let's do it. Nathaniel turned toward the hallway, his voice warm yet resolute. Zoe? A brief pause stretched between them, like a rest note in an unfinished symphony. Then, soft footsteps echoed, light as raindrops on a rooftop. Zoe peeked around the corner, her deep blue eyes, so much like his, blinking curiously at the two adults. What is it? She asked, her voice as clear as wind chimes in the breeze. Nathaniel gestured, a gentle smile on his lips, as warm as autumn sunlight. Come here, sweetheart. Zoe stepped into the room, her small feet hesitant, like a fawn taking its first steps out of the woods. She climbed onto the couch beside her mother, tucking her legs beneath her, tiny fingers still clutching the silver bracelet, the little token that had unknowingly bound them together. Is something wrong? Zoe asked, her voice innocent, yet a flicker of worry clouding her bright eyes. Arya smiled, her hand gently smoothing a curl on her daughter's forehead, as if soothing the whole world with that single touch. No, my love. We just need to talk to you about something important. Zoe's brows furrowed, her tiny face scrunching into an adorable mask of confusion. What is it? Nathaniel took a deep breath, like a diver preparing to plunge into the deep sea. Zoe, do you remember when you said you didn't know who your father was? She nodded, her blue eyes locking onto his, as if trying to read all the hidden stories in his face. Nathaniel continued, his voice careful, laying each word like bricks building a new home. That's because your mother never told you. Zoe blinked, turning to Arya. Why not? Arya squeezed her daughter's hand, her fingers trembling like a leaf in the wind. Because I was afraid, sweetheart. I didn't know what was best for you. Zoe tilted her head, her curls bouncing slightly. But, Mama, do I have a dad? Nathaniel felt his chest tighten, as if something invisible was gripping his heart. Yes, he said, his voice steady but warm, like a fire glowing in the winter night. You do, Zoe. She stared at him, her wide eyes shining like jewels catching the light. Is it you? Nathaniel nodded, his throat tight, as if his heart had just dropped to the floor and bounced back up. Yes. It's me. Zoe didn't move right away, her tiny fingers brushing over the silver bracelet, as if searching for answers in its delicate design. Her expression was unreadable, a closed book no one could yet decipher. Then, after what felt like 1,000 years, she whispered. Do you really mean it? Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees so he could look her straight in the eyes that mirrored his own. I mean it, Zoe, he said, his voice firm, a promise sealed under the night sky. Zoe swallowed, her small lips parting. So, you're my dad. Nathaniel nodded once more, feeling like his entire world had just shifted. Yes, sweetheart. I am. She fell silent, processing the revelation like a little scientist standing before the biggest experiment of her life. Then, she turned to Arya, her voice clear but serious. Did you know? Arya nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks like tiny rivers. I knew, my love. For a fleeting moment, Nathaniel feared she would be angry, that she would storm away like a tiny hurricane in this warm room. But instead, Zoe let out a small sigh, a simple, weighty, oh, like the final toll of a bell ending 7 years of unspoken questions. The air shifted, as if an unseen puzzle piece had finally fallen into place. "What does that mean?" Zoe asked, hesitant, as if standing before a doorway leading to a brand new world. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "It means I'm staying, Zoe. I'm not going anywhere." She studied him, her deep blue eyes flickering with thoughts too big for her small frame. Then, after what felt like forever, she smiled, a tiny, bright smile, like the first star appearing in the night sky. And in that moment, Nathaniel knew he had finally found the most precious thing he had ever lost. After what felt like a lifetime of silence, Zoe did something Nathaniel Owen Clark never expected, something that melted his hardened heart like ice beneath the spring sun. Hesitantly, she extended her small hand, her fingers trembling like the wings of a newborn butterfly, before gently placing it on his. Nathaniel took a deep breath, as if reclaiming his ability to breathe after 7 years of being lost. It was the first time she had ever reached out to him voluntarily, a simple touch, yet powerful, like a bridge spanning a vast distance. Zoe looked up, her deep blue eyes shimmering like the sky after a storm, and whispered like a passing breeze, "All right." Nathaniel intertwined his fingers with hers, as gently as an artist handling their most precious masterpiece. For the first time, she had opened her heart, and he vowed to himself that no matter what happened, he would never let her down. That night, in the unfamiliar stillness of Aria's small house, Nathaniel lay awake, his eyes wide open in the dark, his mind replaying the events of the day like an old film looping endlessly. This morning, he had stepped into the park simply seeking a moment of peace amid the storm of life, stifling meeting rooms, numbers that danced before his eyes, and the grand ambitions he once held. But instead of a brief escape from loneliness, he had found Zoe, the daughter fate had hidden away like a treasure locked in a chest of time. After their conversation in the living room, Zoe remained quiet, like a timid fledgling hesitating at the open door of its cage. She had accepted his presence, but Nathaniel understood that acceptance was one thing, trust was a journey. He didn't know if he had the patience, didn't know what it truly meant to be a father. He, a man who once believed he could conquer the world, now trembled before a 6-year-old girl with eyes so much like his own that it hurt. A soft noise in the hallway pulled him from his tangled thoughts. He sat up, his ears sharp like a watchman in the dead of night. The house was bathed in darkness, save for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains, casting pale golden streaks on the wooden floor like the hesitant strokes of an uncertain artist. Another soft footstep, light as a falling leaf, echoed in the quiet. Nathaniel pushed the blanket aside and stood up, the cold floor sending a shiver through him as his bare feet met the wood. He stepped into the dim hallway, where a small figure near the kitchen entrance appeared, hazy like a ghost in an old fairy tale. "Zoe," he called, his voice low and gentle, like the whisper of the deep forest. She turned, her wide blue eyes gleaming in the darkness. She was still dressed in her star-patterned pajamas, wrapped snugly in a thick blanket, her dark hair tousled like a bird's nest after a strong wind. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said, her voice as soft as a summer wind chime. Nathaniel shook his head, a fleeting smile playing at his lips like a flicker of light in the night. "I wasn't sleeping." He stepped closer, slow and careful, as if not wanting to startle her. "You couldn't sleep either." Zoe hesitated, gripping the edge of her blanket tightly, then nodded slowly. Nathaniel glanced at the clock on the wall. The hour hand had long passed midnight, its silent movements marking time in the quiet house. "Would you like to talk?" he asked, his voice warm, like a cup of tea on a winter evening. Zoe hesitated again, her eyes scanning his face, as if trying to decipher the secrets within him. After a moment, she nodded and made her way toward the worn-out couch, climbing up like a small cat seeking shelter, pulling the blanket tightly around her. Nathaniel sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance, not too close to make her feel trapped, but close enough for her to know he was there, steady like a lighthouse in the midnight sea. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavy, like a velvet curtain draped over a theater stage after a performance. Then, Zoe lifted her gaze, her deep blue eyes shining like twin sapphires under the moonlight. "Are you angry at my mom?" she asked, her voice clear yet sharp, like a tiny arrow. Nathaniel exhaled, his breath dissolving into the still air. He had been angry with Arya for years, angry that she had left, angry at himself for not holding on to her, angry at the silent questions that had tormented him. But now, sitting beside Zoe, that anger faded like mist before the morning sun. "No," he answered, his voice raw with honesty. "I was, for a long time. But not anymore." Zoe studied him, her expression that of a young explorer uncovering a hidden treasure. "Because I found you." Nathaniel felt his heart tighten, as if something inside him had been gently squeezed. "Because I found you," he corrected, his voice softer, deeper, like waves lapping against a rocky shore in the night. Zoe fell silent, tracing invisible circles on her blanket, as if rewriting her own story. "I used to wonder what my dad was like," she admitted, her voice as light as rustling leaves. "I imagined he was important, busy, too busy to come find me." Nathaniel's throat constricted, something lodged there that he couldn't quite swallow down. "I wasn't too busy," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I didn't know you were here, Zoe. If I had known, I would have come right away, not a second late." Zoe blinked, her gaze thoughtful, weighing his words. "Really?" Nathaniel nodded without hesitation. "Really?" She looked down at her wrist, her small fingers brushing over the silver bracelet she wore. "My mom always said I have my dad's eyes," she murmured. Nathaniel chuckled softly, a warm sound, like embers crackling in a fireplace. She was right. Zoe shifted, pulling her knees to her chest, her voice small but certain. "You're not as scary as I thought." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, a faint smile flashing like a shooting star. "Scary?" Zoe shrugged, a flicker of mischief in her expression. "Mom said you were important, that you had a big job. I thought that meant you never smiled." Nathaniel let out a deeper chuckle this time, the creases at the corners of his eyes revealing years where laughter had been forgotten. "I do smile, Zoe. You'll see." A tiny smile ghosted across her lips, like a ripple on a still lake, but she quickly tucked it away, resting her chin on her knees. "Do you want to try sleeping again?" he asked, his voice gentle, like a lullaby. Zoe hesitated before whispering, "Can I stay here a little longer?" Nathaniel nodded, a quiet peace settling over him, as light as a bird returning to its nest. "Of course." They sat there in silence, the dimly lit room wrapped in calm. Outside, the occasional sound of a passing car whispered through the night, steady like the breath of the sleeping city. Slowly, Zoe's eyelids grew heavy, her head tilting slightly as sleep pulled her under like gentle waves. Nathaniel watched as she curled up on the couch, her breathing slow and even, a silent melody of trust. Carefully, he reached out and adjusted the blanket around her, his touch delicate, like a gardener tending to the first bloom of spring. For the first time, Zoe had let him stay, with her, for her. And Nathaniel knew, from this moment on, no matter how the world changed or how time tested him, he wasn't going anywhere. Nathaniel Owen Clark woke up as the gentle morning light filtered through the thin curtains, painting soft golden streaks on the worn wooden floor like the lazy brushstrokes of a half-hearted artist. He hadn't planned on falling asleep on the narrow couch, but somewhere in the night, exhaustion had taken him down like a seasoned fighter flooring an untrained opponent. He shifted slightly, feeling the warm weight of a small figure still curled up beside him, Zoe, the daughter he hadn't known existed just a day ago. She was fast asleep, her tiny body nestled in the thick blanket like a hedgehog tucked away in its burrow, dark curls spilling over the pillow like a midnight stream flowing over rocks. Her breathing was steady, peaceful, like the rhythm of a lullaby he had never heard. Nathaniel sat still, his deep blue eyes borrowing time to take her in, and within him, a strange feeling rose, warm like the first sunlight of the day, yet aching like an old wound freshly healed. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been a businessman with a barren heart, living in a world of numbers and cold contracts. Now, this little girl, this missing puzzle piece he hadn't even known was lost, was here, trusting him enough to sleep beside him. Somewhere deep in his chest, he realized he was no longer just Nathaniel, the market conqueror. He was a father, a title as foreign as it was sacred, like the brightest star in the night sky. Careful, like a man shielding a candle from the wind, he stood up, trying not to wake Zoe. He stretched his stiff muscles, eliciting a few cracks, an ungraceful symphony of middle age, before making his way to the small kitchen. He stood there, hands on his hips, staring at the unfamiliar reality before him. His routine had always been simple: wake up, check emails, sip bitter black coffee, and dive straight into work. But now, there was someone else to think about, a little girl with his eyes and a hesitant smile. He opened the fridge, staring at the pitiful emptiness inside, a few containers of takeout gone cold, a lone carton of eggs, and a jar of expired strawberry jam. His own breakfast had always been coffee and dry toast, but for Zoe, that wouldn't do, she deserved more. Determined like a knight preparing for battle, Nathaniel grabbed the eggs and rummaged under the sink for a pan. He wasn't a cook, God knew he was terrible with anything that wasn't a spreadsheet, but frying eggs had to be easy, right? He cracked the eggs into a bowl, his hands slightly unsteady like a schoolboy standing before the blackboard for the first time. Then, he heard the soft sound of tiny footsteps at the kitchen doorway. "Morning," Zoe mumbled sleepily, rubbing her small hands against her eyes as if to wipe away the last remnants of her dreams. Nathaniel twirled the spatula in his hand, smirking like someone caught in the middle of a foolish act. "Morning, sweetheart." Zoe climbed onto the tall kitchen stool, her short legs swinging, curious eyes fixed on him. "Are you cooking?" "I'm trying," he admitted with a self-deprecating chuckle. Zoe rested her chin on the table, still drowsy like a kitten just roused from a nap. "Mom made the best pancakes," she murmured, her voice small but proud. Nathaniel paused, glancing at the sizzling pan before turning back with a warm smile. "Then I'll learn how to make pancakes." Zoe lifted her head, her eyes widening like freshly polished gems. "Really?" "Why not?" he replied, his voice firm with determination, though deep down, he thought, "I'll probably burn the kitchen down." He plated the eggs, setting a dish in front of her. "Different good or different bad?" he asked, raising an inquisitive eyebrow. Zoe poked at the eggs with her fork, considering. "Not sure yet," she answered matter-of-factly. Nathaniel laughed, the sound ringing like wind chimes on a quiet day. "Fair enough." For a few minutes, they ate in silence, not the awkward quiet of strangers, but a thoughtful stillness, like two rivers slowly merging into one. Zoe took small bites, her legs swinging under the stool, her rhythm as carefree as a child's hum. Then she looked up, her eyes shimmering like a lake under the morning sun. "Are you going back to your big important work today?" Nathaniel took a sip of coffee, the familiar bitterness rolling down his throat, a reminder of the years he had placed work above all else. "No," he said, his voice steady like a vow. "Not today. I think we should go buy some things for your room, make it really yours." Zoe hesitated, like a baby bird unsure about leaving its nest. "Like what?" "New bedding, decorations, books," Nathaniel listed, then added with a playful grin, "maybe even some paint." Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but still hesitant. "Mom let me choose the color for our old house." Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes lighting up like a child receiving a long-awaited present. "What color?" "Blue," she said, her voice small but sure. "Of course," he murmured, tapping his temple. "Because you have my eyes." A small laugh escaped her lips, soft, like the chime of silver bells, but she quickly covered it by taking another bite, as if afraid to let joy slip out too soon. Nathaniel watched her, warmth filling him like a hearth in winter, the way she slowly relaxed, the way cautious eyes were beginning to yield to fragile trust. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe he would stay. And for the first time, Nathaniel knew he had something more valuable than any multi-million-dollar deal, a daughter, and a chance to rebuild what he had unknowingly lost. He looked out the window, where the morning light painted golden hues on the treetops, and thought to himself, I've wasted 7 years, but not a moment more. Zoe sipped her juice, then glanced up. Will you burn the eggs next time? Nathaniel laughed, deep and rich like waves crashing onto the shore. Maybe. But I'll try, for you. And in Zoe's returning smile, small, but bright as the first star in the night sky, he saw a future worth fighting for. That day unfolded in a way Nathaniel Owen Clark had never experienced before, a strange symphony, far removed from the familiar, relentless rhythm of his life. Instead of suffocating meetings, phone calls pounding like raindrops on a tin roof, and negotiations stretched tight as a bowstring, he found himself strolling leisurely through a vast department store, trailing behind a 6-year-old girl with deep blue eyes and curly black hair like the midnight sky. Zoe was neither hurried nor impulsive like other children. She considered each choice with the careful deliberation of a tiny philosopher, as if every decision was a stepping stone on the path of her fate. Her small fingers skimmed over blankets soft as clouds, her eyes meticulously scanned bookshelves with a thoughtful tilt of her head, and when she reached the paint section, she lingered so long that Nathaniel wondered if she was solving a complex equation. Are you sure about the blue? He asked, his voice warm and steady like waves lapping against the shore, as Zoe traced a shade of blue as gentle as a summer sky. She nodded, her eyes shimmering with quiet resolve. Mom let me choose last time. I think she'd like it if I kept this color here. Nathaniel swallowed hard, his throat tightening as if something was lodged deep within. Her words were a tiny arrow piercing straight through him, reminding him of the 7 years he had missed, simple moments like picking out paint colors, bedtime stories, smiles he had never witnessed. It ached, but he was here now, and he vowed to himself that, no matter what, he would not leave again. Then blue it is, he said, his smile flickering like sunlight through leaves. Zoe responded with a small but genuine smile, and Nathaniel knew this wasn't just about paint, it was about an invisible thread being woven back together. The next few hours passed in awkward laughter and beads of sweat. Nathaniel, once a man who commanded an entire business empire, fumbled through assembling a bookshelf, unpacking decorations, and helping Zoe place tiny personal touches in the room. She didn't demand much, she didn't fill the space with extravagant toys or flashy trinkets. Every item she chose was deliberate, as if she were a gardener selecting seeds for spring, as if she still wasn't sure how long she would stay. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the room was no longer an empty space, it breathed with Zoe's presence, from the ocean blue blanket to the worn book resting on the desk. She stood at the doorway, eyes gleaming as she surveyed her work, whispering, "It's different." Nathaniel tilted his head, observing her expression. "A good different?" Zoe nodded slowly, her voice as soft as falling leaves. "Yes." Nathaniel exhaled, feeling a weight inside him dissolve into dust. They ate dinner together, a simple meal of pasta and canned tomato sauce, but to him, it tasted better than any lavish banquet he had ever attended. Zoe spoke about her favorite books, stories of dragons, princesses, and time-traveling adventures, her voice clear and bright like wind chimes in the summer breeze. Then, she looked up at him, her eyes brimming with curiosity like a little explorer mapping an unknown land. "What do you do every day at your big job?" Nathaniel chuckled, keeping his answer simple, as if telling a story to a child. "I meet people, talk to them, and try to make things better." Zoe nodded as if piecing together a puzzle, trying to understand who he was, not just the father who had suddenly appeared, but a real person with a life beyond her world. Night fell, and Zoe climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her small hands clutching the edge as if holding onto a secret. Nathaniel sat on an old wooden chair beside her, holding the book she had chosen, a story about a bear finding its way home. He read, his voice deep and steady like a slow-moving river, and to his surprise, he fell into the rhythm more naturally than he had expected. Halfway through, Zoe's eyelids started to droop, her breathing soft and even like waves against the shore. Nathaniel began to rise, but a tiny voice, barely louder than the night breeze, stopped him. "You'll still be here tomorrow, right?" His chest tightened, as if something invisible had clenched around his heart. Such a small question, yet laced with the fragile fear of a little girl who had once believed her father was too busy to find her. Nathaniel leaned down, brushing aside a stray curl from her forehead, his voice warm like firelight. "I'm not going anywhere, Zoe." She let out a tiny breath, light as a butterfly's wing, her fingers relaxing around the blanket. "Okay," she whispered, then drifted into sleep. Nathaniel sat there for a few moments, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, her face softening into peace, like a quiet lake after a passing breeze. For years, he had believed that success meant never stopping, always chasing, never letting his heart be tied down. But now, in the stillness of this blue-painted room, he realized just how deeply he had been mistaken. Success wasn't power or wealth. It was this moment, a daughter who trusted him, a home he never knew he needed. This story isn't just about lost love or unexpected reunions, it's about redemption, responsibility, and the power of second chances. Nathaniel started as a man who thought he had all the answers, who built an empire from sweat and ambition, convincing himself that the past could be buried. But fate, that mischievous trickster, had tossed a silver bracelet around Zoe's wrist and into his life, shattering the fortress of control he had so carefully built. What makes this story compelling isn't just the shock of discovering he had a daughter, it's his transformation. From a man who lived for prestige to a father who understood that the greatest treasures lie in the simplest things. Zoe didn't open up easily, she was cautious, like a fawn stepping into the open for the first time, hesitant, like a guardian holding the key to a precious vault. But through patient persistence, awkward humor as he learned to be a father, and love that spoke louder than words, Nathaniel proved that he wasn't just here out of obligation, he chose her. And Aria? She mattered too. She wasn't just a shadow from his past, she was a mother who had sacrificed, who had made difficult choices like a soldier retreating to protect the castle. The reasons she left were complex, a mosaic of decisions, but her love for Zoe burned constant, an unwavering flame. When Nathaniel returned, she stood at a crossroads, to keep her walls up or to open the door once more. The ending wasn't a perfect fairy tale, Nathaniel couldn't erase 7 lost years, couldn't rewind time like the pages in Zoe's books. But he was here, proving day by day that he wasn't leaving. Zoe's acceptance, slow, like morning dew gathering on leaves, was what gave this story its heart. It showed that love, whether between a parent and child or a family finding its way back together, doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be present. It's about showing up, about choosing to stay despite the difficulties, about making up for lost time the best way possible. Nathaniel didn't just reclaim the past, he was building a future worth fighting for. A home, painted blue, where Zoe's small laughter was the most precious sound he had ever heard. And so, the story of Nathaniel, Zoe, and Aria isn't just about the past and future, it's a reminder that love, even if delayed, is still worth fighting for. Have you ever thought about the moments you've lost, the second chances life has offered you? If this story touched your heart, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button now so you never miss another story, deep, meaningful, woven with life's hidden lessons. We're here to explore, to feel, and to rediscover what truly matters, every week, every day. Subscribe now, because you deserve stories that warm your soul.